Grüß Gott, meine treue Untertanen, and welcome to the Habsburg discussion. I am the Lord Rivers, or known in Germanic circles as the Graf Rivers, and I am joined by Peter with the History and Sabre suite, and we have quite a discussion for you today about our favorite Habsburgs.
Right, so welcome from me as well. I'm Peter, and as the Lord Rivers himself has already said, my channel is the History and Sabre suite, and we have a really nice Habsburg discussion about all things cavalry, all things Habsburg, all things 19th century for you today. So yeah, let's get right into it.
So the first thing I want to talk about is our ridiculous name generator that we made. This is available on Instagram. We're going to post it a bunch of places. But yeah, we came up with this with our friend Antique Steel. We came up with this amazing Habsburg-style name generator that you can come up with your very own Habsburg persona. And not only is it ridiculous, there's a lot of research and a lot of history in here that can teach us about Austria-Hungary. So it was worthy of discussion.
Right. So, Lord Rivers, would you like to start off with showcasing how it works with your name?
Yes, so let's start with how this works. On the first page, and it's mostly in Fraktur, but I realized that even Germans have a hard time reading Fraktur today. So I put some things in a more legible Roman font. So, do you know the lyrics to Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser? Unser guter Kaiser Franz. Of course I do. I mean, I have the Kaiser chops today. So
oh yes,
of course I know Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser. If yes, I may proceed. How many countries have you visited within the Austro-Hungarian Empire? And of course, there are many countries, modern countries, that were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I have only been to one of them, Italy, and it was previously under Habsburg control, so I do know that part of Italy was under the Habsburgs. So I am an Oberleutnant, though I might use my connections as a Graf to elevate myself slightly. Do you own a Central European sword? Here's the question. Do bayonets count?
Well, yeah, let's just say they count.
Oh, okay. So if we pity our infantry friends and say that the bayonet counts, I do have my Gavia 88 bayonet, which should count as a sword. It's a sword bayonet, so that works. So that works. I will add Franz as my first forename. Do I sport a glorious moustache or facial hair? I would say so. Yeah, I would say so. So I may add Maria as my third forename, and this Maria, we are going to talk about Maria. I am subscribed to History and Sabre suite, paper cartridges, and FTG military history, so I may be a Ritter von. And then the second page, we're going to actually pick out the name. So my name starts with a D, so it's going to be, you're going to have to help me pronounce that.
It's Balázs.
Balázs, okay. Balázs. And then my surname are Baum. Okay, so I'm going to read it through. And my name is Oberleutnant Franz Balázs Maria de Ritter von Baum. And I am, of course, of the Belgrade number 44 Infanterie Regiment, because I always have to pick 44 no matter what. 44th Massachusetts, 44th Foot of the Her Majesty's Army, and might as well be in the 44th Belgrade if I'm going to be over in the Kaiserliche and Königliche Army. Yes.
Nice. Glorious name, I have to say.
There's a bunch of regiments that you can choose from, and we're gonna go through those afterwards. So let's go through yours.
Yeah, right. So let's go through the first question. Do you know the lyrics to Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, unseren guten Kaiser Franz? So yes, I do. I may
But
proceed.
do you know it in one of the other languages of the empire?
Oh, wow. That's a bit unfair.
I think yours should be harder.
Right. Because it's my first language. Well, yeah. Let's just say it counts. Because
Okay,
I do not.
counts. You may proceed.
Right. Thank you. So, how many countries have you visited within the Austro-Hungarian Empire? And from those countries that we listed on the generator, I have visited 6 of those, including Austria, which is the one I'm from and I live. So I am a Feldmarschall, the highest rank possible. I just about made the 6. And
amazing.
Do you own a Central European sword? So to my right, there's the Austro-Hungarian M1861 infantry officer's saber. So there's another one here and another one in the back and another one somewhere here. So I have a bunch of those, which means that I get to add Franz as my first forename as well.
Yeah.
And I do sport a moustache, which is on its own. So no other facial hair, but the glorious moustache is there.
Very good.
So that gives me Maria as my third forename. And as already teased, we are going to talk about that in a second. Now, I am also subscribed to all the 3 channels, the History and Saber Suite, my own, and of course, FTG Military History, as well as paper cartridges. Now, on to the name section. My first name, P, makes me an Albrecht. So put together, that makes me Feldmarschall, Franz, Albrecht, Maria, Ritter von, and my surname, Čačkovič, because my surname starts with a P as well. Funnily enough, my actual surname is Hungarian. So...
So how many different ethnicities are in your name?
Now, in my name, we have the Franz Albrecht Maria, which is German. The Čačkovič is Slavic. And we have, well, I'm going to choose the regiment of the Hussars, which is the 14th Hussars von Kolozsvári. And I think that counts as the Hungarian part in my name.
Excellent.
Because, yeah, that's the name my great-grandfather, who I never knew, but he was in that regiment, apparently. So, yeah, I'm going to put up a picture of him now so you can see his uniform, and that's what tells us he was in the 14th Hussars. So, yeah.
So let's just go through and talk about a little bit of the history behind what we chose here. First, I do want to mention the font again. Faktur was the stereotypical font all the way through the 1940s in Central Europe. So it's very funny that most of us have a hard time reading Faktur, but it would have been mostly the only font printed for the longest time. But now we have a lowercase k is pretty difficult in Faktur. So we went through, we did the different countries. One of the things that was interesting was, of course, there's different ranks for some things in the cavalry and the infantry. So we did have to you can choose a Hauptmann if you're going to be in the infantry, and Rittmeister if you're going to be in the cavalry. I think that's always a hilarious rank, is Rittmeister.
Yeah, basically means just riding master.
Yeah. So for Central European sword, Franz, of course, I always think of Franz Josef, but Franz is just such a stereotypical Austro-Hungarian name, so it's great that we put that in there. Tell me about Maria, though, because there's so much context to Maria that I'm not even up on.
Right. So basically, Maria is, obviously, it's a female name, and it has a very Catholic or generally religious connotation. And as we all know, and as you might know, the Habsburgs were very devout Catholics. So putting that in there for the religious connotation alone makes it quite funny and tongue-in-cheek. And there's another factor in this. namely that it's very posh to have, as a man, Maria as your second or third forename, which still happens sometimes in modern day Austria. Because, for example, we have this famous actor who's a little older now, so it's not as common for younger people at this point, but this actor is called Karl Maria Brandauer, and we have another guy, for example, around 1900, who was the publisher and editor-in-chief of an army newspaper, an Austro-Hungarian one, and he was also called Karl Maria Danzer. So it's just a name that you put after the first or second male given name. I love that it
sounds pretentious, that it has a pretentious context.
Yes, it absolutely does.
That's
and
amazing.
That's just funny.
Yeah. So the next question, we went, we are humble people, of course, so we only made Ritter as, you know, there are no Herzogs.
No.
But we went with Ritter, and for the ladies, there's Edelvon.
Right.
Because there is no female Ritter equivalent. So, with the names page, I like that I did find a 5 krona stamp.
Oh yeah, that's really cool.
But so tell me about the names that you selected and why. You know, what's the story behind some of those?
Right. So I went online because the historical army lists for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and even earlier for the Austrian Empire, you can look at those online, and looking at those at the names of the officers and also of the we say Unteroffiziere, so the non-commissioned officers. They are just all over the place. You get Hungarian forenames with German surnames and vice versa, and also with Slavic in between. So what we did basically is I chose a bunch of those common surnames that were to be found in the army lists, and also for the surnames, some are made up, some are combinations of real ones, and some are just very typical and common, even to this day, names of German, Hungarian and Slavic origin. And if you mix them together, you really get something that resembles some of the original historical names. So it's kind of realistic.
I had to add in some of the great ones like Benedict and Radetzky. You know, you have to throw those in. So it's great.
Right, the big names always make it fun. Sure.
Okay, so now we have to go into the big section at the end, joining your regiment. And this one actually isn't part of the generator. You just get to choose yourself. And I thought that was kind of cool because people might have connections to you know, the infantry or the cavalry. And of course, you have the connection to the hussars. I also put in the k.u.k. wagon corps, which is very important.
Yes.
Very exciting. So let's briefly talk about the concept of k.u.k.
Yeah, absolutely. So k.u.k.
Kaiserlich and Königlich.
Yeah, that's right.
So what does that mean? Why are we talking about it? Why is it on everything?
Well, basically it was on everything historically, and k.u.k, so Kaiserlich und Königlich, translates to imperial and royal in English. And that just means and alludes to the dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire that we have between 1867 and 1918. And that was a political construct, and in technical terms, it was a real union and a personal union of Kaiser Franz Josef. So he was Emperor, Kaiser of the western half of the empire, so Austria, and he was king of Hungary and various other duchies and countries that actually belonged to the Kingdom of Hungary at the time. So we have the emperor and the king at the same time, and that's what makes Austria-Hungary, basically. So yeah, we have k.u.k, and all the official army designations, ranks, and you know, branches of government, they all have this k.u.k designation put in front of them.
So a huge part of the army is k.u.k. It's going to be, the main infantry regiments, the main cavalry regiments.
Right.
That's going to be part of that Imperial and Royal Common Army. What's the term in German?
Right. Gemeinsame Armee.
And then they're under the Hungarians, and then in response to that, under the Austrians, we have the Hungarian Honvéd, which is kind of like the... it started out as like the Hungarian militia, but they end up pouring more and more money into it. And then the Austrian Landwehr, a separate Austrian army that isn't part of the Common Army. But in theory, they're supposed to both be supporting that Common Army. But so most of these are from the Common Army. We have a lot of the fun infantry regiments that are on there, and the general staff, of course. And then some great ones for dragoons, uhlans, and hussars. And we're going to talk about that a different day, that these are very different cavalry arms, but they're actually surprisingly similar in the Austro-Hungarian period.
Right,
so,
that's right.
But we'll leave that for a different day, because that's a long discussion. So I wanted to go over... we received a lot of questions about this. You have questions, I have questions. Let's go through some of those.
Right. So the first question was basically, shall we talk about swords at this point?
I guess we have to talk about swords.
All right. So what swords would have would cavalry officers or cavalrymen of the time have carried? That was basically the question we received, and I'm just going to show it to you. I have to. So basically we have this here, which is the M stands for Muster, English pattern, M1869 cavalry officer's saber, and this saber, as always, has a pendant as a trooper's saber, which is a bit simpler. The shape is the same, but it's a flat steel of sheet with holes and punctuations through there. Very simple. The officer's one has this floral design decoration. And this is the officer's saber that all cavalry officers between 1869 and 1908 would have carried and owned and fought with and carried everywhere, because in 1904 the successor pattern came in, but that didn't roll out until 1908. So that's a very common saber. You see it on a lot of photographs, paintings, basically everywhere. So that was the cavalry saber for the latter half of the 19th century in Austria-Hungary. So yeah, that's the one.
And all three of those cavalry arms would have carried that same saber, correct?
Right. Yeah,
Amazing.
Absolutely.
So with that sword there, did people actually train in the use of that sword? I mean, it's one of those questions in the 19th century is, is it ceremonial? Are we actually still training with the sword? Is there still a focus there? So was there a sword culture still?
Yes, very much so. So much so that obviously for military and uniform purposes, the sword was a vital part of every officer's uniform. And especially in the cavalry, the training with the sword was still very important for officers, maybe not so much, but for troopers, horsemanship and swordsmanship for cavalry troopers was still at the heart of their job, basically. So they did train. And also for the infantry, where the officers mostly carried swords, there was also a sword culture there. And fencing was still instructed and taught at the time, very much so. Training was not centralized, but kind of a federal thing. But you had this multi-centric arrangement where it was prestigious. The academy in Vienna was very prestigious, but for example, if you go to the modern-day Czech Republic, in Prague was also a fencing school. By the way, the director of that school was Gustav Herxel, the guy who wrote the Duell Codex in 1882. So kind of a famous name. He was the director there. And fencing at the time was also becoming a highly popular sport. And in Austria-Hungary, the influence of Italian fencing was increasing rapidly at the time. And by about 1895, you have this guy called Luigi Barbasetti, an Italian fencing master who opened his school in Vienna and taught, the aristocracy or people, members of the bourgeoisie who thought they wanted to be someone. And he taught those people, and eventually the army adopted his new method as the regulation for officer training, fencing training, because it was highly successful at the Olympics and as a sport at that time. So that's basically
that gives me an interesting idea, because there is a sword culture even amongst civilians. And in Germany, we know there's a strong dueling culture.
Oh, sure.
There's those young German officers that all want to get those dueling scars. So was there a dueling culture in the Austro-Hungarian army?
Yes, there was. Now, that's a multi-layered question, but the simple answer is it was prohibited both by civil law and the military law code as well, and had been forever. But unofficially and officially, you could say, it was tolerated. And we have this concept of Duellzwang. So Duellzwang basically means you have to duel. So it's basically a noun. And what that means is, as Hungarian-American historian István Deák puts it, it was basically the army created a culture whereby it was always advantageous for an officer to engage in a duel rather than not. And in some cases where there should have been a duel in the eyes of the military honor courts, as they were called, Ehrenräte, and the officer for some reason didn't challenge his opponent, he could dishonorably dismissed because he was not man enough, quote unquote, to engage in a duel. So unofficially, there was a highly developed and regulated dueling culture, and it was very much a thing. So, yeah.
And that actually, they had to go and ban it during World War I, did they not?
Yeah, right. Now, we don't know how common dueling was at that point. Some army newspapers around 1910, they say it has become a rarity at that point from their perspective. Even officers wrote about it that way. But then again, why did Kaiser Karl have to issue this final and ultimate ban on dueling in 1917 still, right in the latter half of the First World War? So it's kind of a curious thing, and nobody has the exact numbers. But yeah, it remains interesting even today.
Well, that leads me into my next question, which I got on Instagram, which was, what happened to Karl?
Oh, yeah, right.
You want to go into that? Karl after the war? Well, I know he went into exile in Portugal, but I really don't know the rest of the story before that.
Right. So, when the Republic of German Austria, as it was called, Deutsch Österreich, was basically proclaimed, I think it was in November 1918, after the war had been lost. He didn't immediately abdicate because he wasn't gonna. And what he did, he had to go to exile. I think initially he went to Switzerland, but he tried to regain control. And at some point he did abdicate for the Austrian, for the newly created Austrian state. But formally he still was King of Hungary. And there was a regime in Hungary called the Horthy regime. So this guy who was in charge called Horthy. But in the end, Horthy wasn't going to give him the throne, and he couldn't become or remain king of Hungary either. And after that, he did go into exile. And yeah, you want to go on and tell our viewers what happened to him? I just know
he died of pneumonia, and it was... It's tragic. Yeah. It's because that's 1922.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And on the island Madeira, where he
on Madeira. Maybe he
went with his family.
Maybe he had some Madeira. Now it's his son. Is his son Otto?
Yeah,
So that's the connection there, because I'm always fascinated by the. I think I've watched it so many times, all the different clips from the Otto von Habsburg funeral.
Yes, 2011.
Yeah, and everyone came out for it. The Schützen clubs, all the different heritage organizations, the army, everybody.
Yeah, fraternities, Catholic fraternities, everyone. No, I wasn't, unfortunately.
Oh, unacceptable.
Yeah, I know.
Not dedicated to the Habsburgs at the time.
I was only 17 at the time and in Tuscany.
No excuse. Another former Habsburg land.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So that's interesting though that it was Karl's son was only just buried.
Yes.
And I love the exchange that happens at the actual tomb. You know, wer ist da? And then they go through the entire list of his titles. He's the he's Otto von Habsburg, and then all the things. Lord of the Vindic March. That's my favorite title of Franz Josef. But then he goes, wir kennen ihn nicht. And then they say it again, and I'm sure I think the second time they listed out his civic titles, that he was part of the European community and all his work there, still wir kennen ihn nicht, and then a humble sinner.
Right.
So I love the feigned piety, the feigned humility of the Habsburgs for their burial ceremonies.
Yeah, the metaphor, death as the great equalizer. It's quite powerful, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It's very beautiful. I wonder, there probably won't be any more Habsburgs buried there.
Absolutely not. No. He was the person who was actually, heir apparent. He still had, this direct connection to being the child of the last emperor. So we don't have that anymore.
So there was an actual direct connection, and now all the other connections are just, through lineage.
One thing to mention, which was quite interesting, because during the Catholic Mass in St. Stephen's Cathedral in the heart of Vienna, all the political representatives of the Republic of Austria also attended, because Otto von Habsburg was quite a renowned political figure throughout his life, and they played the Kaiserhymne. So
I know. I've watched that video.
Yeah.
More than I can say. Now the funny thing is, there's one video in particular where for some reason, and I think my friend and I kind of, add our own captions to what's happening. But there's this guy that takes a Habsburg flag and is twirling it in the middle of the aisle the whole time, and you can see it's moving the feathers on people's hats. People are just kind of looking at him, and it's like, it's kind of an odd choice to do the flag twirling in the middle of the aisle. Yeah, and that brings me for the Kaiser hymn. Yeah,
right, and that brings me to my point that all the top representatives, the president of Austria and the chancellor and everyone was there, and the ministers, and obviously during that song, that hymn, they all had to remain silent as representatives of the Democratic Republic, So that was kind of hilarious to watch. It's an impossible moment.
I encourage people to go watch those videos, because you can see there's some people with modern uniforms on that are, you can tell they're holding back. There's some people that clearly are just, kind of just, contemptuous, and then there are people that are totally into it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we might as well talk about that. Like, can you talk about what is the Habsburg nostalgia today? Like, what's people's view of Austria-Hungary today?
Well, I think the image of Austria-Hungary is still very much connected to the old emperor, you know, Franz Joseph I himself. And
Yes.
yes, right, the glorious beard. And he is very much still remembered very fondly as he was when he was old, but still alive at the end of his life. He was very popular at the end of his life, and he's still remembered that way. And the reason why the monarchy today in Austria is remembered quite positively, I'd say, is of course because it kind of counterbalances the Nazi history of World War II and before that we had in this region and in our history, which is something that was a very dark chapter. And people, of course, we have to remember it. People do remember it, but you're not proud of it. And the monarchy is something that really counterbalances that in a way that makes people kind of, you know, proud of their past, if you will.
Yeah, and I like how complex people's views of Franz Joseph are, because in the beginning, you know, the Habsburgs are very much struggling in the mid-19th century. 1848 is a nightmare with the Hungarian Revolution and then calling in the Russians. And then, you know, the disasters in 1859 and then 1866. Young Franz Joseph is not having a good time. People don't really see him in a great light, and yet he becomes the grandfather of the empire. He's everybody's grandpa. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. And you could compare that to Queen Victoria as well, because she had a very long reign.
I think it's almost the same years.
Yeah, I think she ascended in 1837, I think it was.
Yeah, it's 37 to 01.
Yeah, so just a bit earlier than Franz Joseph, but you know, the era very much overlaps. So, yeah. So, speaking about the modern image of Austria-Hungary in Austria, what about the image of Austria-Hungary, you know, in the Anglophone regions or cultures of the world? UK,
that
US?
That is a great question. That's a great question, because I think in a lot of ways it is very remote. In Britain, there's definitely the connection with Germany and France, but Austria is a very remote concept. And to America, it's even more remote. In fact, you know, have you seen The Illusionist?
No, I haven't.
Okay, The Illusionist is a movie about magicians, but trust me, it's amazing. So there's a difference between accuracy and authenticity in movies, I think. Some are, you know, they have every last detail, but they don't get the feel of it. And for some reason, I really think The Illusionist captures the feel of Austria-Hungary at the time. You can see Rudolph in it. You can see the Hofberg. It's an awesome movie, but there are some people I've met that asked me if that was a real country.
Wow. Okay.
So sometimes it almost gets seen as a made-up stereotypical European kingdom. And I think it gets used like that in early Hollywood, too. That it's just this made-up, faraway place where there's always some princess getting married off, and you know, they wear their funny uniforms and they have their schloss. Like, it's funny. So
yeah, but you know, I mean, temporally speaking, it is kind of surprising, because we're talking about just over a century, which isn't all that much in historical terms. So how much times can change in global awareness and in shifts of power is really quite interesting, that people from a nation that rose to prominence in the 20th century, not long after Austria-Hungary was a thing, really don't know about the old empires of Europe anymore. It's really quite interesting.
No, and there's not a lot of, you know, conflict or friendship between the United States and Austria-Hungary. You know, we can talk about the Austria-Hungary was very insular in a lot of ways.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
They didn't participate in the scramble for Africa or the scramble for the Americas, really. So they're not putting themselves out there in the same way that everyone else is. But
okay, so now that I'm speaking with the Lord Rivers, which isn't really a German name, and it alludes to your cultural background, so I'm wondering, what's your interest in Austria-Hungary, and how did you become interested in this concept at all?
That's a good question, because it began with my friend Brett and I. We ended up talking a lot about Austria-Hungary in the lead up to World War One, and in the a lot of the mid-19th century conflicts. They're kind of on the periphery. They're always on the wrong side, it seems.
Yeah.
And because of that, sometimes they're very funny. I love Austria-Hungary because it's the epitome of all those dichotomies of the 19th century that I love. It is old and new. It is east and west. It's attempting to be modern in so many ways, and yet they cling to tradition. They're so efficient in so many ways, and yet so ridiculous in others. It's the dichotomy that draws me to it. And you know, it is a dual monarchy, but the whole thing is dualism. Everything is dual. So, you know, whether you look at culture or economy or the military, there are two faces to everything in Austria-Hungary, and I love that.
Yeah, that is very interesting, and I think you're not wrong. It's a very, as you said at some point, it's kind of a peculiar place. So I would agree.
Silly place.
Sometimes it can be.
It is a silly place. So I have a couple more questions that we need to answer from the people. Why the white uniforms? There are two answers to this. You know, there's the on paper answer, then there's the real answer.
Right. Let me get started with the.
You can tell me your nostalgic answer. What's it supposed to mean?
All right, so the nostalgic answer, what people, officers, or the general staff would have told the Kaiser, it's very imperial. So, I mean, just imagine facing an enemy, the Austrian Empire or Austria-Hungary, and you face the foe, and they're all wearing white uniforms, and the light is reflecting, and it's very bright and majestic and imperial. So. It's quite something. So, yeah, it looks cool. Very pure.
So, that's one way of looking at it. There are two other answers. One is the economy of it. Because the scale of the Austrian and French armies is you know, unimaginable compared to the small core of, say, the Prussian or the British armies. And so they have to make a lot more coats, and if you don't have any dye, amazing. You just put out white wool. If you want to make it whiter, you put chalk into it. And so you issue that chalk, that's how they make it bleached white. And so a lot of early French uniforms, and then the Austrians, you know, absolutely go with that white, and they just chalk it up. And, you know, there even is a debate about how white they truly were in practice, because you know you have a lot of artists and miniature painters and a lot of different people portraying them kind of as a dingy white. And an interesting thing that I'm going to go deep into in my channel, it's a full conversation, but in the 1850s, they actually did a test on the visibility of uniform colors. And white wasn't that bad at any distance. You know, if you think about a dingy white on any sort of bright background, that's going to basically blend in. You know, if you think about marching through the mountains, the dingy white is going to be much better than blue or red.
Absolutely.
Even though red is a concept for a different day, because after about 1,000 yards, the red just looks kind of brown, and you can't really it looks great. It looks
great. But yeah,
but that's something for a different day.
Right, as you said, it's kind of a multi-layered question as well. So yeah,
yeah, I love the white uniform question.
I think all those answers have some merit to them.
Yeah, yeah, but it's definitely the most imperial color possible.
Definitely.
Yes. My last question, I think, is going to be, what are your favorite Austro-Hungarian military commanders?
Right. So, as I already hinted at or talked about in the Instagram Live we did, I'm going to go back a little bit to the early 18th century. First Schwarzenberg of the Napoleonic Wars. He's not Austro-Hungarian, but he was Austrian in that sense. And I think he's a very interesting personality because he was this, sickly boy and young man. He had to take breaks a lot from army service because his health wouldn't allow. But he was still brilliant, and he got to know Napoleon. He was around behind the scenes. He even marched into Paris at some point, and he was just this commander who did a lot, even though he was absent a lot. And he was great politically as well as militarily, so that makes him kind of impressive to me. I like Schwarzenberg.
He's definitely operating up at the grand strategy level. He's not the guy that's leading a cavalry charge. He is the one doing a lot of backdoor political dealings and dealing with, mobilizing the Austrian army, on very little notice. You're trying to play that chess game with Napoleon and also playing it against his frenemies, his allies / potential rivals. So Schwarzenberg is very interesting, and anybody that's studying later Napoleonic Wars has to know Schwarzenberg. And I'm in the middle of reading a very long book about the Waterloo campaign. I'm 30 hours in on the Audible, and I haven't even got to Cachabra. It's ridiculous. It's amazing. But they talk a lot about Schwarzenberg talking with correspondence with Wellington and the coordination there and the theories there, and it's very interesting what the moves he was making.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
In terms of Austrian commanders in the Napoleonic Wars, of course, Archduke Charles is amazing. You gotta hand it to him. He's younger than Napoleon. He's up and coming. He learns from Napoleon. But if I'm gonna choose my favorite Austrian commander, I actually have to go with another proponent of the giant Franz Josef chops is Tegethoff.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go with an admiral instead of a general. And Tegethoff, famous at the Battle of Lissa in 1866, and he's basically the only one victorious in that war. He's for those of you that don't know, the Battle of Lissa was one of the first grand-scale engagements with ironclads. If not, it was the first large-scale fleet action with ironclads. And a lot of the guns weren't penetrating on either side because the armor was so heavy, so they ended up just ramming as if it were, the Battle of Salamis. But he's a daring commander. It's such an interesting story to read. But Tegethoff comes back as one of the very few victors in that war. And yet on land, things not going so well.
Not really. Especially in the middle of the 19th century and into the 60s. Not good. So, but yeah, you speaking about Tegethoff, there's actually still a lot of places that remind us of those commanders, because looking around Austria, we have Tegethoff squares still, and other, streets and places that are named after people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have one large road here in the center of Graz, which is called Konrad von Hötzendorf Straße. And that's been controversial for a number of years because he was a controversial figure after the empire for political reasons. And we also have other places that remember or remind us of this past that we had here in this geography. For example, we have a Laudongasse, we have a Radetzky-Straße. So people often don't realize, but if you look and if you know where to look in everyday life, you can still see a lot of the remnants of these people. So it's kind of interesting. Amazing.
So that is all we have today for our Habsburg discussion about, starting with the name generator and hopefully answering some interesting Austria-Hungary questions. So thank you for joining me. And if anybody has any other Austria-Hungary questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have any angry comments about Austria-Hungary, also leave those in the comments.
Yes, we want to know about
are good comments. Yes. Check out the history and Sabre Swede. Check out FTG Military History and check out Paper Cartridges, where soon we're actually going to have the Mad Magyar. It's going to be some manlicher fun. So
nice.
Interesting stuff going on. Lots of Austria-Hungary content coming your way. Und thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the conversation and this long format that we did. Also stay tuned for 2 more videos like this. The Lord Rivers and I, we recorded 2 more shorter episodes, going more in depth with some of the topics that we touched upon in this episode. Now please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you're not missing out on any of this future content, and also please check out and subscribe to FTG Military History, the channel run by the Lord Rivers, which will also be linked down in the description below. Now, one final thing, please be sure to share your own Habsburg persona with us in the comments down below, either on this channel or on FTG Military History. We will be glad to have a look and have a laugh together. You can find the name generator on Instagram following the link in the description, or just go back to the timestamp in the video earlier so you can pause the video and do it that way. Now, on that note, thanks so much again and see you in the next one. Bye bye.